Winter in The Last of Us represented two main things. Firstly, the harsh cold of snow and blizzards accentuated the notion that this stretch of the game's story would be the darkest yet, with the comforting warmth of hope far out of sight. It also marked the first point that Ellie was playable in the series, showing her true capability and cementing her as one of the best and most well-rounded protagonists in recent memory. It's by no coincidence then that Naughty Dog has decided to open their sequel, The Last of Us Part 2, in winter, with the series' darkest and most hope-depriving moments being contained just within the opening hours of the narrative. As the game progresses and you descend deeper into a story of loss, grief, hate, and continuous cycles of violence, you find a game that greatly succeeds in its thematic ambition and continuation of its characters' storylines.
What are you doing?
To say much more about the narrative outside of its opening hours and thematic bearings would be to spoil an experience that simply must be played without any presumptions. The continuation of Ellie and Joel's story provides some major changes to both the structure and dynamic of both the greater world and characters, but also their personal relationship. Whilst the sequel takes the story and characters in drastically different directions than previous, it's noteworthy that Part 2 still feels like a natural progression of what came before. In contrast to the original's themes of love and solace, the sequel's themes of hate and grief deliver some of the most nuanced and challenging moments in any video game, placing the player in situations that ask a lot of them, both as an active and passive participant in the story and world. Naughty Dog isn't afraid to solicit such rash emotions as anger and hatred, but at the same time ask you to be patient and see where the story goes. The way in which the story has been crafted, with specific attention to what narrative elements the player sees, hears, and feels, is nothing short of masterful in its execution. The main issue that can be found within the narrative, however, is its pacing. Compared to the original's rapid barrage of emotions, story beats, and characters, Part 2 is a much slower and contemplative experience, with its structure even feeling somewhat episodic. This slower pacing can especially be felt in certain sections of the game's latter half, with very little reward in the form of character or story beats. This slower pacing also seems to have had an adverse effect on the game's writing and supporting cast. Naughty Dog's much more grounded approach to characterization and writing, while certainly complementing the game's much more grounded tone and themes, creates a slight dissonance between you and Ellie. In the first game, Ellie's presence allowed room for an audience surrogate, where you were experiencing and discovering new people, locations, and enemies right alongside her. In Part 2, Ellie's exchanges with friends, whom she's known for quite some time up to that point, slightly alienate the player, making them feel less of an active participant and more so a viewer of a series you'd often find on HBO.
What you got there?
Bigot sandwiches.
Smells good.
This isn't to say that what dialogue is given is even remotely bad. Dialogue exchanges between characters still hold the trademark Naughty Dog wit and charm. Moments where characters discuss their plans for the evening, tease each other about their nerdy interests, and jokingly lament over not being born in a time where they can attend comic conventions, offer a brink of hope and much needed reprieve in such an otherwise bleak game. These exchanges are also bolstered by brilliant vocal and motion capture performances from each and every cast member. Series regulars Ashley Johnson and Troy Baker once again steal the show as Ellie and Joel respectively. Johnson's conflicted performance of a young woman trying to process her grief, slowly letting hatred get the best of her, produces scenes you won't be forgetting long after you put the controller down. Troy Baker's much more wearied and less anger-prone take on Joel in Part 2 is a nice contrast to Johnson's Ellie. It's clear that the character has gone through some major change in the 4 years between games, and the performance reflects that excellently. New characters such as Shannon Woodward and Stephen A. Chang as Dina and Jesse respectively feel like worthy additions to this series' large cast of characters. Laura Bailey's performance also can't go understated, with her driving home some of the game's most emotionally fueled moments, all of which are captured brilliantly thanks to Naughty Dog's industry-leading motion capture. This helps the enemies that you face off against also feel unique and utterly dangerous in their own ways. Infected feel more terrifying and dangerous than ever, with clickers filling any arena with instant dread as their distinct clicks and the last remnants of their humanity cry out. Seraphites and the Washington Liberation Front compose the two main human factions in the game's Seattle landscape. Each type of enemy requires tactical planning to handle encounters without unnecessarily draining resources. Both human groups differentiate themselves from each other not only in appearance, but in how their AI interacts with other characters and the world. Seraphites use a combination of quiet bow and arrow attacks with devastating melee weapons to combat Ellie both from afar and up close. By contrast, WLF soldiers use their robust military equipment to their advantage, with high-powered firearms and rifles forcing the player to time their shots carefully, unless they want to be staggered on the floor and lose a considerable amount of health. Encounters such as these can often turn from challengingly fun to annoyingly difficult, as you're often thrown to the ground from the impact of a shot without an instant save roll mechanic. This occasionally means getting up from a shot only to be immediately thrown to the floor once again. Whilst it certainly fits the grounded tone of the game world, it simply isn't a fun endeavour and often results in an unavoidably brutal death, captured in horrific detail and aided with animations that simulate the haunting reality the developers aim to facilitate. The brutality isn't just felt with the gameplay, however, as enemy AI is used brilliantly in a way that only furthers the game's narrative and themes. Whereas the first game's world still brilliantly captures the kill or be killed mentality of its post-apocalypse, Part 2 breathes even more humanity and stakes into any and all encounters. Human enemies shout out fellow comrades' names upon their deaths, which spike the discomfort I haven't felt since Spec Ops The Line back in 2013. The WLF also brings dogs into the equation, which means whenever you're unable to evade them completely, you're unfortunately forced to have to put them down in order to escape with your own life. Dogs are just one of the many examples in how Naughty Dog weaves its themes throughout both story and gameplay, and raises the bar to which games such as this can aspire to. The final sweeping shot of the game itself acted as a reflection of the amount of care and attention Naughty Dog placed within every aspect of the game. The many approaches in which the gameplay reflected Ellie's journey of loss, grief, hatred and violence made for an experience that could only truly be experienced within the video game medium. The Last of Us Part 2 is simply a landmark achievement in storytelling and is greatly aided by its much more grounded and relatable story that not even the original adventure could have offered. The Last of Us asks you to love and cherish every moment with those close to you, but Part 2 asks you to cry and to feel so much sadness and grief that you can't help but sympathise with Ellie's need for vengeance. Most importantly, the game asks you to be patient with its narrative and characters, to tell a story that isn't just one it wants to tell you, but a story that needs to be heard. Whilst minute issues such as pacing and small gameplay annoyances detract from the overall experience, it still stands tall alongside its predecessor, cementing it as one of the best of this closing console generation.
I'm gonna find. And I'm gonna kill. Every last one of them.